Hello! The Happy Hermit again to talk to you about stories, literature, and everything else under the sun. Today is what we call un classique. Ooh la la! The Red and the Black by Stendhal. For those who like to follow along, I'm reading the Modern Library Classics version translated by Burton Raffel. Let me use this as an opportunity to encourage those who want to read translated works to pay very close attention to the translators, particularly with classics. So many versions are from translations that are either out of date or not intended for casual reading. Sadly, these are the ones that are typically free. So with a book like The Red and the Black, when someone says they thought it was boring, the first thing I wonder is which translation they read, because some of them are, indeed, dry and dusty. Because The Red and the Black is supposed to be witty, this isn't one of those books that you read just to know what happens next. It's full of funny lines and observations. Consider this quote, made by a society girl at a fancy party, about a man condemned to death in attendance. Quote, "I think being condemned to death is the only real distinction," said Mathilde. "It's the only thing that cannot be bought." End quote. Stendhal sets up lines like this like beads on a string, the great trick being that they thread neatly through the narrative itself. Mathilde means what she says seriously here. She thinks this man is the most interesting man at their party and is seeking his company. She's not just dropping some witticism. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let's start with the book description. Quote, "The Red and the Black, Stendhal's masterpiece, is the story of Julian Sorel, a young dreamer whose desire to make his fortune sets in motion events as compelling as they are tragic. His quest to find himself, and the doomed love he encounters along the way, are delineated with an unprecedented psychological depth and realism. Stendhal's portrait of Julian in early 19th century France remains an unsurpassed creation, one that brilliantly anticipates modern literature." End quote. This is really trying to make a pitch to the studious crowd, I'm afraid, and ends up selling itself short. Don't get me wrong, I support literature from the gutter all the way up to the tallest of ivory towers, but The Red and the Black isn't around because it's some dusty relic that deserves respect. It's around because generations of readers loved it. The way to read The Red and the Black is like a streaming show. Think of the chapters like episodes that string along together with many subplots and side characters, and a dreamy lead of Julian Sorel, the ambitious young peasant searching for his way in the world. It's separated into 2 books. Think of them as seasons. The first book is solid from end to end. Julian gets a job as a tutor for his small-town mayor, ends up having an affair with his wife, and further shenanigans. The second book is bigger in every way. He's in Paris with a wealthy titled family going to endless parties, this time having an affair with the daughter. But this is where skimming will come in handy. There's a sort of completionist reader that will hate what I have to say, but to happily read the classics, you must learn how to skim well. The second half of The Red and the Black has several sections in it that meant more to readers in 1830 that doesn't mean that much to us now, including a whole side quest where Julian goes on a secret mission on behalf of France's gentry to start a war that goes nowhere. I implore you, particularly in Book 2, to read closely when you're interested and to skim once you get bored, just like you might pay less attention to a plot in a show you're less interested in. The end is good, there's several good moments in the middle, and it starts well. You will find parts that are extremely enjoyable, it just gets repetitive. Now, to start off, I need to give you a very broad picture of what France looks like in 1830. I want to emphasize that I'm not going to go into all the details of Restoration-era France. I'm drawing in very broad strokes here. So, this is after the French Revolution and after Napoleon, where the monarchy was restored, but not in the same way as it had been before. France now has a constitutional monarchy, with Charles X as their current king. Make no bones about it, Charles wanted to be an all-powerful king like before the Revolution, but wasn't quite there yet. So politically, what this meant is that you basically had the royalists who supported giving more power to the king, and the liberals who favored more power to elected positions. Now, the king made no secret about being elitist. He was very much of the royal position that aristocrats were civilized human beings, and everybody else were the unwashed masses unworthy of consideration. He really saw the public as children that needed to be managed by the firm paternal hand of their betters, or you're asking for another reign of terror. Charles had no concept of any of the socio-political issues that caused the French Revolution, and firmly thought it was simply the wrong set of people running things. Napoleon's downfall served as further confirmation that if you give a commoner power, they'll just waste it, a similar attitude the wealthy always have about giving poor people anything. Charles was for returning all land to the noble families who owned it pre-revolution, as well as returning the Catholic Church to its former position, so essentially he had the church in his pocket. There's a couple of other terms that will need cleared up. First is peasant. In the modern era, we tend to imagine peasants as rural workers who lived in huts in a vaguely medieval way, but 1830s France wasn't like that. Peasant here just means working class. Peasants could live comfortable lives and own businesses, but they didn't have titles or positions generally, and had to work for a living. Julian is a peasant, one that very nearly rises in position, but doesn't quite make it, from the beginning to the end of this novel. They also mention Jansenists here quite a bit, who are merely anti-royalist members of the clergy. It's worth noting that the two priests called Jansenists here aren't particularly interested in overthrowing the king or anything like that. In fact, they're the only ones concerned with the spiritual side of their jobs. What they have instead is a lack of deference to the aristocracy. Now, let's look at the title, The Red and the Black, the most common interpretation being that this is representing the military and the clergy, the two career tracks a commoner could take to move up the social ladder. But red and black are also blood and bile, passion and death, and the colors of gamesmanship. After all, red and black are the basic colors in a deck of cards. A way to read this book is of a vast game of cards at a casino where the players are bidding high despite only vaguely understanding the rules, and there's a hell of a lot to lose. And the player we're following happens to be Julian Sorel. Julian starts out in the small town of Verrières, the runt son of a well-off peasant who has no use for a bookish boy in his sawmill. If you've ever seen Disney's Beauty and the Beast, it wouldn't be far off to describe him as a gender-swapped version of Belle, nose in a book stuck in a provincial small town wanting more. Verrières suffers from a small-town mindset where, quote, the tyranny of opinion, and such opinion, is every bit as idiotic in the small towns of France as it is in the United States of America, end quote. For context, Stendhal had just finished discussing how Verrières tended to resist any improvement to the status quo, punishing elected officials for deviating too far from what they're used to, even when it's to their benefit. His swipe at America is that as a democratic institution, from Stendhal's position, they tended to be rather populist, going with the whims of a fickle public even when it defied sense, whether that meant keeping slavery as an institution and also bragging about freedom, or waging a foolish war against England in 1812 that led to the capital being burned to the ground. France was sensitive about this mob-based rule, which, in the end, isn't democratic because it's based on who has the power to rally up the biggest crowd response. Populist rule is being ruled by lynching and riots, rather than good sense and order. Julian is introduced after being dragged out by his father, shirking his job and reading instead. Here's his introduction. Quote, his cheeks were purple, his eyes cast down. He was a small young man, 18 or 19 years old, not appearing very strong, with irregular but delicate features and an aquiline nose. His large black eyes, which at powerful moments indicated thought and passion, were at the moment sparkling with utter hatred. His dark chestnut hair, worn very long, covered much of his forehead, and, when he was angry, gave him a wicked look. Among the innumerable varieties of the human face, there well may be none more striking. His slender, compact form was more indicative of light quickness than power and energy. End quote. The one thing we're sure of is that Julian is good-looking. Both his lovers, Madame de Renal and Mathilde de la Mole, are willing to go to great risk to be his lover. De Renal never had one outside her husband, and Mathilde chose Julian to be her first, despite having the creme de la creme of Paris at her feet. The key thing for a reader is to determine whether Julian is smart. It's clear Julian thinks of himself as superior. He sets Napoleon as his role model, as an example of merit rising to the top over class and privilege. He also looks down on the village of Verrières, the other students at the seminary he later attends, and the socialites in Paris society he eventually meets. The one thing that backs his intelligence, other than his bookishness, is his memorization of the Latin Bible and ability to quote it from memory. Quote, "Open it at random," Julian went on, "and tell me the first word of the paragraph. Until you ask me to stop, I will recite from memory this holy book, our rule of conduct in everything." Adolphe opened the book, read out a word, and Julian recited the entire page with the same facility he would have had in speaking French. Seeing their parents' astonishment, the children opened their eyes wide. A servant came to the door of the room. Julian continued to recite in Latin. The servant remained, at first motionless, and after that left. Soon Madame de Renal's chambermaid, and also another woman, the cook, came and hovered near the door. By then Adolphe had opened the book in 8 different places, and Julian went on reciting with unchanged ease. "Ah, my God, what a handsome priest," said the cook loudly. She was a thoroughly good girl and deeply devout. End quote. Note the cook did not say what a devout priest Julian is. The trouble here is Julian has a sort of photographic memory, evidenced also by the Marquise de la Mole sending him as an envoy after proving he can quote that day's newspaper verbatim after briefly reviewing it. But does that equate to intelligence? What we see here is an ability to parrot information accurately, but when he has to transcribe letters for the Marquise, he makes enough errors that they have to be rewritten. He's able to retain vast amounts of information, but that isn't the same as learning it. Julian is clear about scheming to move up the ladder through hypocrisy, by saying and doing whatever it takes, whether he means it or not. However, his understanding of people is extremely basic. In fact, whenever he's analyzing other people's motivations, he's always wrong. He completely misses Madame de Renal's crush on him at first. Once he is aware, his boorish behavior nearly ends the affair before it even starts. His rise is a series of happy accidents rather than his own planning. His father gets him the position at the Renault's mansion. Madame de Renault falls in love with Julian despite himself. Their affair becomes a problem, so he gets sent off to be schooled at a seminary, fully paid, where he happens to choose a priest as his confessor who has connections to the Marquise who needs a secretary. So, in this game of social mobility, who's Julian playing against? The answer is everybody. First, he's playing against his kin. Had Julian worked well in the sawmill, he would have never left. His father would not be motivated to pawn him off to the local mayor as a tutor. It also provides him with his initial impulse to rise, because if he was appreciated and rewarded for his bookishness where he started, he might have been happy with a modest life. He's also playing against the aristocrats, who see peasants as little more than animals who need to be kept at heel. Stendhal describes the relationship in a fable about an English traveler and a tame tiger. Quote, "An English traveler tells how he lived on familiar terms with a tiger. He had raised it, and he stroked it, but on his table he always kept a fully loaded pistol." End quote. This quote is powerful because it fits all the differences that class makes and makes you ask in any relationship, who is the human and who's the beast? Are the peasants the pet of the aristocracy, or is it the other way around? Because the very center of the book is a trip the king makes to Verrières, where he is paraded to the town's glory, very similar to animals in a circus. And if it's man versus beast, will he be able to reach that gun in time? There's also a sense of unnaturalness, a tiger living in a domestic situation it's not meant for. It reminded me of this quote by Herzog in the documentary Grizzly Man about Timothy Treadwell, who gets mauled to death by bears. Quote,
"What haunts me is that in all the faces of all the bears that Treadwell ever filmed, I discover no kinship, no understanding, no mercy. I see only the overwhelming indifference of nature. To me, there is no such thing as a secret world of the bears. And this blank stare speaks only of a half-bored interest in food. But for Timothy Treadwell, this bear was a friend, a savior."
End quote. Like Timothy Treadwell, throughout The Red and the Black, characters project themselves onto others. Julian only sees love in others when he feels it for himself. In both Madame de Renal and Mathilde, mistakenly observe it in Julian when he's not thinking about them at all, because they feel love for him. Julian misinterprets the general disinterest of the elite as acceptance. Both Monsieur de Renault and the Marquise are exclusively using Julian as a tool to fit their own needs. De Renault to give himself a social boost, and the Marquise as a secretary. Julian considers de Renault a father figure, but while paternalistic, he's not treating Julian like he does his real son. His real son he allows to do what he likes without supervision. As another elite, he's given the room to determine his own course unencumbered. Julian is tightly controlled. He's given assignments. He's to go to the opera and pay attention to other people's behavior. The Marquise gifts Julian a blue suit, which he can wear to imitate an aristocrat. Quote, Julian did not particularly understand what this was all about, but at the same night he paid a visit wearing the blue suit. The Marquise treated him like an equal. Julian was quite sensitive enough to appreciate true politeness, but he did not understand its subtler aspects. He would have sworn, before this new whim, that the Marquise could not possibly have received him with greater respect. When he rose to leave, the Marquise apologized, since his gout prevented him from showing Julian to the door. End quote. Later, the Marquise makes a point of treating him like a servant again when Julian is wearing black, making it clear that he is still a servant, even though he's allowed to play act in his master's clothes now and then. And thus, Stendhal shows us the danger in rising socially. Throughout the book, Julian is taking risks, but the thing that takes him down aren't any of these gambles, but by the very act of rising, he's imperiling himself. From the very beginning, Julian takes a set of roles as a phony. Early on, at a public function, Julian is placed in Verrier's guard of honor in military dress simply because Madame de Renault wants to see him dressed up. He was not a soldier at all. Later, because he was asked to accompany Father Chalon, the local priest who helped teach Julian in the first place, dressed in priest's robes while not being a priest, and in the process of changing forgets to take off his soldier's spurs. Later, the Marquise amplifies the false rumor of Julian being a noble's bastard son. The thing is, when a person rises by sneaking into the fold, they are at constant danger of being unmasked. The people around him have the power, at any time, to strip him of his pretensions and cast him back down to where he came from. It is inevitable that this will happen the moment he stops being useful. That moment comes when he gets Mathilde pregnant. Father Chalon calls him an upstart and lets the Marquise know about his indiscretions in the de Renault household. Keep in mind, the Marquise was performing the 19th century version of a full background check, and we as readers need to decide whether it's done in good faith or bad. What we know is that the Marquise had been in negotiations about Mathilde's marriage since the beginning, and while we see Mathilde and Julian's interpretation of the Marquise's decisions, we really don't know what he's thinking. In any case, he ends up falling out with the Marquise, shooting Madame de Renault, who recovers, and being executed for it. So Julian plays the game and ends up losing, but if in the end he won, what's the reward? What lies behind these gates of society's paradise? The world is one of aristocratic society with fancy dress balls and expensive banquets, but the world runs on sheer boredom. These aren't the great conversationalists of the world. They take no risks. When you're playing a game and hold most of the cards, you stay ahead by keeping the stakes low. Because you have more to lose than gain, you avoid playing when you can, and when you must, you draw things out as long as possible. Socially, this means scripted conversations, elaborate etiquette and manners, learning to use as many words as possible to say as little as possible, focusing on the minor and unimportant, staying on the very surface of things. These wealthy aristocrats have a very mattered sense of shallowness, because when you have the means to change the world, you learn to watch your mouth, because idle talk easily turns into intent, and that's how things get out of control. In this world of empty chatter, it's easy to get offended, because the job of conversation is to keep the real world, and thus responsibility to it, far, far away. Quote, "The masters of the house suffered, at bottom, from too much pride and too much boredom. They were too accustomed to insulting others in order to relieve their own boredom to expect their visitors to be genuine friends. Still, except on rainy days and at moments of truly fierce boredom, which did not occur very often, they were always perfectly polite. In the Marquise's dining room, provided that you did not make jokes about God, or priests, or the king, or those holding government posts, or artists patronized by the court, or all established ideas and institutions, provided that you did not praise the satirist Berenger, or the opposition newspapers, or Voltaire, or Rousseau, or anyone who indulged himself even a little bit in freedom of speech, and provided, above all, that you never discussed politics, in the Marquise's dining room you were free to talk about anything you like." End quote. They're not particularly smart. Through the entire book, the elite are easily grifted if given half a chance, and because they are untrustworthy people who have no friends, they tend to overestimate other people's plans. They invest far more in projecting the image of authority than practicing it. The most effective tool these people have is that of pageantry. The central scene in the book is when the king visits Verrières, and with him comes a whole retinue with parades and fireworks and public ceremonies, having public religious ecstasies and the wine flowing. The town itself gets a full cleanup, with the roads being repaved and the houses painted. As the Roman poet Juvenal once said, "Give them bread and circuses, and they'll never revolt." And it's true. The public tends to respond positively to spectacle, even when it doesn't give them anything in the end. Even though Stendhal was critical of the elite, he hardly thought the liberals of his day were beyond reproach. The representation of them is Monsieur Valenod, who, under the pretense of helping the people, pocketed funds from prisons and charities, tried to seduce de Renault's wife, and aggressively self-promoted. Rather than pushing for democratic values, he was a wannabe noble who would pursue his own elitist agenda, just like the current nobles given half a chance. He had a mobster's sense of acquiring power. Quote, "Monsieur Valenod had more or less said to the province's grocers, 'Let me have the two most stupid among you.' He said to the purveyors of justice, 'Show me your two most notable ignoramuses.' To the supervisors of health, 'Tell me who are your most crooked.' And when he gathered together the most brazen in every business and profession, he said to them, 'Let's rule together.'" End quote. Rather than trying to make things better for everybody, Valenod proposes making the elite class more diverse, with himself as the first diversity hire. At the end of the book, he's literally pursuing a title for himself and his family after taking the mayorship from the de Renaults. Meet the new boss, same as the old boss. Even Julien, who starts off on the liberal side, shows the problem with rising through assimilation. Not only are you in constant threat of exposure, but it does little good for anybody else if you manage to rise only by changing yourself to be one of them. It's like the end of Animal Farm, where the creatures outside looked from pig to man, and from man to pig, and from pig to man again, but already it was impossible to say which was which. At the end of the story, Julien is discarded by the aristocracy the very second he stops being useful, and all the toadying in the world does not allow him to keep his head. The only person left to mourn him at the end is Mathilde, who sets up a shrine to Julien, not based on who he actually was, but based on a fantasy where she's the romantic heroine of a doomed love affair, left to perpetually mourn, finally succeeding in her lifelong mission to be more interesting. The question this leaves us with is, if the aristocracy are greedy dullards who aren't good for anybody, and the liberals are just social climbers who are out for themselves, how does one live a good life? Well, the people who seem happy are the ones who avoid the scene altogether. Early in the book, Julien visits his friend Fouquet, who has a sawmill and offers him a lucrative, though modest job of running the books. Julien refuses because it offers no glory. To emphasize how free he would have been, Julien spends a night in a cave on the way there. The only time he expresses the feeling of being free is in this cave, where he has no expectations to fulfill, no society to impress, no schemes to enact. It is the only place he can be completely himself, and he rejects it. He closes the door on any kind of possibility of happiness, for if you are turning to social status, needing to be better than others, needing to be legitimized by the royals and bosses of this world, you are honoring others more than you are honoring yourself, and you lose yourself in the end. The Red and the Black paints the picture of society as fundamentally empty. No matter how high Julien climbed, he finds himself surrounded by sycophants and humbugs who know very little outside of themselves. Stendhal is clear that when we have no reason to take them seriously, that it is best to put our attention and effort elsewhere where it counts. To close, I can't remember a single meal anybody ate in this entire book. It would be typical of the wealthy set here to throw multiple feasts but not have a single dish worth eating, food for the eyes but not the mouth. Besides, they would not want to get grease or crumbs on their fancy frocks, I'm certain. Happy reading!